So tonight we've got a screening of Margo Nash's intensely personal work, The Silences. And the screening will be followed by a conversation involving Margo and filmmaker Jeni Thornley, who also happens to make very personal films. I've known both Margo and Jeni ever since the Sydney Filmmakers Co-op days in the 70s, where their films were first screened and where I saw them for the first time in the cinema. Their early films were really groundbreaking works, and subsequently they've never really stopped challenging the form. So I think you'll be in for a very special evening tonight. So by way of a brief introduction, Margo Nash is a filmmaker and a senior lecturer in creative writing in the School of Communications at University of Technology in Sydney. She has produced, written and directed a number of award-winning documentaries and fictional films, as well as working as a cinematographer and a film editor. Her credits include the experimental shorts We Aim to Please and Shadow Panic, the feature documentary that she co-directed For Love or Money, and the feature dramas Vacant Possession and Call Me Mum. Jeni Thornley is a documentary filmmaker, writer and film valuer. Her poetic essay documentaries Ireland Home Country, To the Other Shore, Maidens, and the collaborative feature documentary For Love or Money are landmark films in Australian independent and feminist cinema. They're widely distributed and were also broadcast on ABC and SBS. Jeni is a research associate at UTS, where she lectured in the course Issues in Documentary, while producing her documentary Ireland Home Country as her doctorate. She is currently developing an archival project, Memory Equals Film, based on her Super 8 collection. Jeni's films are available on the VOD website Beamer Film, and film For Love or Money is with Ronin Films. Okay, so that's intro to Margo and Jeni. Now I'd like to have Margo introduce The Silences.
It's kind of wonderful to be able to present the film on International Women's Day and to be in conversation with my old friend and colleague Jeni Thornley. We spent many years working on the feature documentary For Love or Money, which was a feminist rewriting of history, a history of women's work in Australia, and was a huge project. I sometimes think about For Love or Money and call it my film school, because that's where I learnt so much about film. This film was made outside of the conventional funding structures by choice. It's a very personal story, and I didn't really know when I started working on it if I had a film or not. And by the time I kind of started editing it and had a cut of it, I was kind of too far down the track to stop. And I kept going, and somehow or other I've managed to pull something together. I thought I'd just, by way of introduction, read a short paragraph from an article that I've written about the creative development of The Silences. This article is going to be published later this year. And because I'm an academic, I've had to learn to think more academically about things. There's a different part of your brain. There's the filmmaker brain, then there's the one that analyses. So I had to wait till I finished the film to do this. So this is really just following on from thinking about what Jeni and I and Megan McMurtry and Margo Oliver did in For Love or Money, which was to excavate the oppressed past of women's history. Feminist documentary filmmakers have excavated the oppressed past, telling and retelling history to include rather than exclude women. They have shown the unshown by portraying the lives of ordinary women. At times personal and self-referential, these films have engaged in what Michael Renoff calls a new subjectivity, which included works by women and men of diverse cultural backgrounds, in which the representation of the historical world is inextricably bound up with self-inscription. Through their exploration of the social self, this is a quote from Renoff, through their exploration of the social self, they are speaking the lives and desires of the many who have lived outside the boundaries of cultural knowledge, and in so doing have challenged the symptomatic silences of the empowered, where self-reference is shunned. Feminist filmmaker and academic Michelle Citron argues that autobiography bears witness to the untidy and contradictory nature of our lives, and in so doing risks exposing that which culture wants silenced. I hope you enjoy the film, and I hope we can have a really great discussion afterwards about the silences. Thank you. I grew up in a house of secrets. I didn't know that my father was mentally ill until I was 10 years old, and my older sister took me aside and told me. I knew the atmosphere in the house could suddenly change, and all hell would break loose, but still it was a shock. I also didn't know that my mother had suffered a long and debilitating depression until I started making this film. My mother always said that she was never depressed. She came from a generation who was stoic. You didn't complain, you just got on with it. But this made her bitter, and this bitterness lived on in the silences, which she filled with exaggerated stories, often mixed with cruel observation. I was the youngest and often bore the brunt of this. I couldn't wait to leave home. How I hated her. And at the same time craved her love. I search for ways to tell this story. I find images in films I have made, like these. Memories and dreams hovering on the edges of consciousness.
Margo, look, it's very moving for me to be here with you, especially on International Women's Day, for this conversation about your very, very personal and moving film. The personal was political back then in the 70s, and I would say it still is. The personal is political, and I sense the transforming power of this work for myself, certainly for Margo. It's a deep inner journey, and I think that it perhaps triggers our own feelings about our own family of origin, our own minds. There's a growing corpus of autobiographical texts that The Silences joins and is informed by. And perhaps this will unfold in the Q&A, and perhaps there's some other autobiographical filmmakers here too, and we look forward to your Q&A after this conversation. So I wanted to start with Margo's main theme for tonight, which is the creative development of the silences, the evolution of structure, and unlocking the story. I'll just say you got script development funding in 2003 to develop a feature film about your mother, My Mother Eve. And your earlier...
A fictional film.
A fictional film. And your earlier fiction film, Shadow Panic and Vacant Possession, and Call Me Mum, to some extent, were created from memories and scenes, or informed, certainly Call Me Mum, from your own childhood, perhaps.
Not Call Me Mum, that was Kathleen's.
Yes.
But I recreated stuff, it's true.
The abandoned child is the ongoing theme.
It's true.
And
I dressed Lynette Curran to look like my mother, I think.
Yes, and there she is in this film. So I guess the first question is, how did the creative development of The Silences evolve from these works, and what led you to the documentary form in that process?
Well, I wrote this big feature film script, which was fictional, and in a way, it was based on my relationship with my mother, but it was a fictional story, and in the same way as my film Vacant Possession, the father was based on my father, but it was a fictional story. My mother Eve was about a young actress, which I was. It was a whole other ball game, but it was a big movie because it was set in the 1970s, and it was just really hard to get financed and hard to get a producer. And we all know what it's like to have all those projects that you've spent ages writing scripts and sweating over and not being able to get going. And I had a job. I got old. I took a job at UTS teaching, and it was really hard to get a big feature film made when you've got another job, and I just lost heart with it. I just lost heart, and I put it away in the cupboard, as you do. But the story of Felicity wouldn't leave me alone. It was what, we've got this guy at UTS who, head of research, he says, you get an itch, and it was my itch. It was like I couldn't leave it alone. I needed to tell that story about Felicity, and I just kept thinking maybe I could make it as a documentary, but I didn't. I thought, well, what have I got? I've got a lot of family photographs. I was obsessed with the family photographs as a child. Dad had a darkroom. Some of them were very good quality. I'd had bits of sort of crappy footage I'd shot, on little cameras, and one cassette that I'd recorded of Mum one day when she didn't even know, and an oral history I'd done with my sister when I wrote a chapter for a book on memory and suburbia about growing up on the hop farm, and that chapter was more about Dad and his work, and because I am hop royalty, and so it was about growing up on the hop farm, and so I'd done a 3-hour oral history with my sister and taken her back to the hop farm in her imagination and got her to talk about it, and I had that, and then bingo, I suddenly went, oh my God, I've got all my films, and I've been drawing on that story and other stories from my childhood in not all my films, but most of them. Even films that were about other things, I'd draw on memories to create a scene. Like The Little Girls on the Train, which was for a little documentary film I made about girls in care and at risk, or the eye through the doorway. They were all from a little documentary that I'd made. And Shadow Panic, I'd developed images from my childhood, and Vacant Possession literally recreated some stories, some scenes. And they were really well photographed and, by really good cinematographers. And I thought, oh, maybe I've got a film because I can draw on my own work and I don't have to pay copyright. I didn't know I'd have to go and spend a lot of money getting them on high definition. But anyway, that's another story. And so I thought maybe I've got a film, but I didn't know. And then I got this residency, which you see the credit at the end. I got a 14-week residency in Zurich in 2012, and to be a filmmaker, amazing. And I just had to do some master classes, and I had the rest of the time to develop a project. So I took everything with me. I taught myself Final Cut Pro, editing, and I just started cutting and writing with the images and writing the narration as I wrote it. And so it was this sort of... I'd written an academic article about creativity called Unknown Spaces and Uncertainty in Film Development. And I'd talked about the uncertain nature of the creative process and how the funding bodies always want to lock you down, and you always have to have a script that's going to be exactly what it's going to be, and the only people who can go off with just a little treatment are people like Rolf de Heer. There's not very many people like Rolf who can get the money to go and make a film like that, and I wanted to make a film like that. I wanted to enter an uncertain space and I sort of knew some things I wanted to do, but I wanted to just free fall into that unknown space and work intuitively and see what happened. And I wouldn't have to be beholden to anyone because no one gave me any money except Zurich, and they didn't care whether I had a film or not at the end. They just wanted me there. And I came back and I had a cut.
So do you think that actually working outside the industry in the way that evolved with this film that actually created the conditions for you to really work in quite a different way than if you actually had gone through the process of a script development, approaching Screen Australia, and the whole sort of juggernaut
I
of that
suspect
process.
I'd still be in script development instead of having a film, because my experience, the funding bodies, they always find ways of saying no to you, and it's so disheartening, and we all know what that's like, and I just wanted to it was so personal, I said, I don't care, I've got a high-paying job, I'll just do it. And I don't have children, I'll just do it. And
I mean, I do think it's incredibly brave of Margo, of you, to actually undertake something without any institutional finance at all. I mean, apart from the Zurich artist in residency. But it takes a lot of courage, I think, to leap into that space where there isn't any endorsement happening from any of the kind of film institutions around us. And I wanted to acknowledge you for that, because I think that actually that perhaps harks back, interestingly enough, to a way in which we started working in the beginning as filmmakers. It's not unknown to us to work like that.
That's right. And I wanted to kind of go back to that kind of fresher space, because I've seen filmmakers go over and over and over scripts until they're dead. And then if they make them, they usually hate them. So, I wanted to try that, but what I wanted to talk about was how it had its strengths and it had its weaknesses, because that cut that I came back from Zurich with, it wasn't perfect and it didn't have a perfect structure, but it had some great sequences that just kind of fell out in that intuitive way. But the structure really needed a lot of work, and that was what was interesting to me, was how I solved it, because it took me quite a long time to solve it, because I think when you step into autobiographical work, there was a point when it was a bit like, who do you think you are? Great Uncle Frank who sailed the seven seas. I started, researching the ancestors. It had nothing to do with the story. And so there was all this rubbish fascinating to my family, but not to another audience. So, what's the story? You have to come to what's the story. And also that sort of thing of starting to work kind of chronologically. But I always knew that I wanted the story about Felicity to be a surprise. So if I told the story chronologically, then Felicity's story would be told before I was born. And I didn't want that. I wanted people to find out about Felicity when I did, because I was just a little girl, and I found those photographs, and they have obviously had a huge effect on me. And I wanted that surprise to happen, but I'd set it up in this sort of slightly plodding chronological way, and I didn't know how to solve it. It was kind of messy, and I tried various screenwriting templates because I teach screenwriting. I tried all of it, nothing fixed it. I brought a script editor on who wanted me to make the whole thing chronological, and it was dead as a doornail. And so I just brooded for a while. And I went to a conference in America, a screenwriting research network conference in Wisconsin, and I heard this American screenwriter called Larry Gross talk about, he gave a keynote called The Watergate Theory of Screenwriting. And, remember Watergate with President Nixon, the whole question was, what does the president know and when does he know it? And for screenwriters, what does the audience know and when do they know it? What do the characters know and when do they know it? And he used a film by Kurosawa called Ikuru, To Live, about Mr. Ikuru, who we learn in the very opening that he has cancer and he's dying, but he doesn't know. And it created this incredible suspense, and I thought, maybe I can do something like that. And that's when I went back and I tell the audience right in the beginning about Dad's mental illness. So I didn't let that come out chronologically. So that when I did that, it kind of unlocked the story, because you know that, and then you're waiting to find out. You can see Mum doesn't know. You know that kids know, we don't know. And so that seemed to create some sort of suspense. And I think that thing about when you impart, whether you're working in documentary or fiction, it's about how the writer lets people, the audience, in on knowledge, when they let them in and when they don't, when you withhold knowledge, when you tell knowledge. And that to me was that was the key that unlocked the story for me. Once I did that, I could then work thematically and make big thematic leaps in the story, and then backtrack to tell the Felicity story, and to stay on track in that theme, and so that the third act goes into when I go back to try and find her and find what happened to her, and to stay in that sort of work thematically in a way. Does that make sense?
Yes, it's what I find interesting when you talk about your process, you use this term brooding, which I think Susan Dermody wrote about in one of her essays. Perhaps you could open up that a little bit with us, this brooding with a work. How does that relate to how you worked with this?
I think it's a little bit like the idea about uncertainty, that you're in a space where you don't know what's going to happen. You don't know what you're going to do. You don't know how, and you've just got to kind of chew and brood. And Susan wrote that great article about brooding, and it really spoke to me, because I thought, yes, I really need to think about these things and let things come to me in a way, like going and hearing Larry Gross talks. It came to me, and then I could use it in a way, but brooding around things. And Keats talks about the ability to be in uncertainty. And Jane Campion worked with this idea a lot when she did Bright Star, about being Keats's idea about being in uncertainty. I've gone blank. Can't remember what he called it now. And so when I got stuck on the structure, I brooded, and I started working on the photographs and photoshopping and cleaning them up and scanning them, because it took hours to do some of them. And as I looked inside the photographs and worked slowly on them, I saw things I'd never seen before. It's like meditation, and within that meditative space of doing something else, then a big idea would come to me to go in and fix something. So I think it's that when you turn one part of your brain off, you allow the other part to work, and then it's like when you wake up, you can't solve a problem, and you walk away and suddenly it comes to you, the answer comes to you. It was, I think that idea about brooding is just allowing that sort of space to be with the problem and not feel that terrible pressure that you've got to solve it now, but letting it just sort of
Would you say you also
ferment.
Would you say you also approached your own films, and your previous films, of which there are sequences of in this film, with that same brooding, sitting with... Can I just lead you into that a little bit by saying the cut I saw, I think when I saw a cut of the film when you were making it, I made a note before we had our discussion. That's part of what we do as filmmakers. We make a cut and we show our colleagues and friends, in all sorts of ways, for comments, and then we brood on that and then maybe take that back into the cut. Anyway, Margot showed me a cut, and at the time I made a note and I said, forgive me for saying this, that's what I made a note of. This is a film by the daughter. Now we need an edit by the filmmaker. Meaning, I wanted you to reflect on your previous films with more self-reflexivity. And you did go back, and you screened it also to other people who made comments. So can you speak to the process of delving into the images from your other films, which I find really very moving, the clips from the films. This is perhaps my fourth viewing of the film, but I find the sequences with your the actor who plays your father, and then coming to the real photographs of your father in the film, I find that very, very moving in a way that I haven't felt before. And I must say that when I watch a film, I'm drawn by my own affect, if you like. And I was deeply, deeply moved in this viewing by the photographs of your father for some reason. Interesting.
I think when I first started using the clips, I went to the obvious. I went to some of the clips from Vacant Possession that were recreations and worked with them in. And when you first saw that cut, I think a lot of the use of the clips were illustrative rather than metaphorical, and they were helping to tell the story. And there's still quite a lot of stuff that's illustrative in here. And then Jeni came and saw it. Sarah Gibson also saw that cut, and Sarah said, where are you in it? There's not enough of you in it. I want to know what you feel and how this family affected you. And there's nothing, you're just not in there. It was like and that was really interesting. And then Jeni had said, go back and look at the film. So it was there was those two things. I went back into the films looking for images that spoke to emotion and feeling rather than literally being illustrative. And I also thought, why aren't I in it? I mean, I don't know, but why aren't I in it? And I think there's that women's filmmaking is seen as someone described the film to me recently as confessional, and I thought, I didn't do anything wrong, I had to confess. That's, it's sort of like this, there's something, this self-reference, I read that thing to you in the beginning, the self-reference is shunned. It's seen as being weak, female, all of those things, and I thought, have I internalised the narrative of the empowered, and where self-reference is shunned, and I'm too scared to put myself in there? Well, okay, I'll get brave and put stuff in there. And so that's when I had that second pass, and I went back into the films, and I thought, where are the metaphorical images that talk about the emotional state? And the one that I remember really strongly that I found, I thought, okay, is the one where it's a high shot of Pamela Rabe from Vacant Possession. She's tossing and turning on a bed at night, and she tosses and turns over. And I thought that restlessness of the dreams and of the unconscious, and when you come out of a family like mine, it nags at you. And so there were images like that I thought spoke of how the family had affected me, I suppose. But there were, there are things that I had put in my films, I think, really consciously, and then there are other things that were really unconscious too. And so I went looking for them as well.
So can you give us an example of what that might be in terms of the unconscious in the other films, and that you brought in? Are you saying that you brought that to consciousness by selecting it to put it in the work?
I think that some of the images in Speaking Out, the little doco I did about young girls in care and at risk, the little girl in the schoolyard, the trains, I think I was illustrating their stories when I made that film. I didn't actually realise I was telling my own. I knew the eye through the door, the little girl looking through the door. I knew that was my story because I spent so much of my childhood at night trying to see what was going on and being scared. And but there were other images that it wasn't until I was looking for images to tell the story, I thought, oh my God, there's all those bloody trains that I'm still phobic about, that because I was going to go and sleep in the railway station, and I'm still a bit funny about trains, and there was full of trains. So I think that was unconscious.
I think the trains are very interesting in terms of, I'm taking a leap here to say the trains are very interesting because part of the soundtrack And the work you do in the film around your father's paranoia and the post-traumatic stress that he was in that precedes his descent into his breakdown and madness, the soundtrack of that you use in a number of your films is actually almost like the inner soundscape of what it was like to grow up in that family. I think that's what I find so affecting in this film, is to have known you as a person, to have worked with you, to know those other films, but now to be with you in this work while you, in a way, we go on a journey with you while you're trying to make sense of insanity in a way and make it understandable to yourself, and therefore you're making it understandable to us. And I think that that's a very powerful dimension of the work, and I think that the way that it's actually speaking to people, the fact that you've got a national theatrical release of the film, I mean, is
I'm
really
astonished, to be honest.
a film that is as introspective as this. I think it's really a testament to some dimension the film is, some work it's doing for us, your work that you're doing in a way for us, for audiences, to actually try and piece things together. Can I just bring one other example in? I remember when I first saw Helmer Sanders Brahms' very wonderful film, and I know we speak about it, Germany, Pale Mother. And one of the amazing is one of the post-war German women filmmakers who's tried to make sense of what happened to Germany and what happened in the aftermath of the Reich and the Holocaust. And I think what's amazing about what she did, and I felt her in this film.
She is in this film, even though I didn't use clips.
She
I
is
tried
in this
to.
film. I hadn't seen that till tonight. I thought, my God, here's Germany, Pale Mother, and it's where you deal with the trauma of war juxtaposed against the fragility of the nuclear family. And I think that you do that really, really well in terms of the father's breakdown, the war, the Petrovs, and this fragile breaking family that's being split asunder, everyone in their own chaos, if you like, inner chaos. So
I think the thing that I really learnt in making the film was there is that big grand narrative of World War II and my father's illness and all of those, but in fact what was happening with my mother during that time, that's the messy story of life. That's the messy story that doesn't get told. That's the story full of conflict and contradiction. That's the story that isn't heroic, that isn't the underdog overcoming things. That's the story of the mess of life.
Are you referring specifically to the firstborn child there, or everything about your mother's life in that family?
I think from the firstborn child.
From
the
repression.
I think what happened to Mum during the war, because she was in her prime, she was working, and then it all went to shit. And it could never be spoken about. It could never be talked about. And she had to just white knuckle it and deal with it. And that's not a great heroic story. It's a tragic story. And I had a lot of sadness in feeling her pain, I think, because I did know what my father went through, but I didn't quite get what she'd been through.
Is that, can we open that up a bit? Is that because that was so, I know we've got to, soon we'll just wind our conversation up and open it up to you, but is that because her story was so deeply secretive that it was so repressed, whereas
his spilled out into daily life. You know, police would come, he would be hospitalised. You know, there was a certain point when it couldn't, you know, I had to be told because you couldn't really hide it. I mean, I really did think all families were like ours for a long time. But that story was, she just couldn't talk about it. It was so hard, and so I think her pain was very deep there, and somehow or other that got transferred to me to tell that story and to speak that mess of life, which often films don't talk about the mess. They talk about, they tie things up neatly, and I wanted to leave the film without it being tied up neatly. Of course, I forgave her, but I wanted to leave it with complexity, with psychological complexity. And I think if I'd had a broadcaster or a funding body, they would have made me have more of a happy ending, and I really didn't want that. So for my sins, that's what I did.
But I take that point. However, there is a resolution in the film, and I don't think it's just a kind of Deuxième Machine kind of ending when you do the can with your sister and her daughter, and the beautiful choice of the Maori song
Yeah.
which I found so deeply moving in a way. The music, the singing, the hymn, the choir, really brought together so many of those painful layers, and we, in a way, allowed us to sit with that, I think. That's how I felt with that viewing, that we could sit with that pain and be eased through that with the singing and with the making of the cairn. Did you feel a resolution in that process?
So, yeah. And I certainly wanted to create that sort of silence at the end for the audience to reflect. And just going back to what you were saying before, I think what I've discovered from the screenings showing the film at film festivals, it brings up people's stories. People come and tell me incredible stories. It stirs things up. And my friend Bridget Eichen said, your film gives people permission to speak their stories. And like Janet Frame, because she, of course, produced An Angel at My Table, and she said Janet Frame's work also gave people the permission to speak about mental illness, because there's still such a sort of, even though it's different now to when I was growing up and when Janet Frame, was nearly given a lobotomy, it's still there are still a stigma around mental illness, and sometimes I think it's good not to talk about it because to protect people because of that. So it's finding those kind of balances.
I wanted to thank Margo for trusting us, the audience, with this film, because I think that actually there's a act of trust here. And I wanted to read something that's from the essay that Margo quoted at the opening of her talk, before the film. She writes on trust in this essay, "Can you trust my story? Does it matter if you don't? I'm sure it will be my truth or a good attempt at it. But will it dislodge your truth and loosen your tongue? Or will you shut the door again and be sensible and get on with your life?" And then I just wanted to make a big leap and say, last week I watched some of the broadcast of the inquest with Pell at the Vatican, and the sex abuse survivors' T-shirts and slogan is "No more silences." And so in conclusion with our conversation, I'd like to agree, no more silences, and thank Margo for opening up the silences of her family and sharing with us. Thank you, Margo.
Thank you, Jen.
Yeah, as you know, I'm working on a film about my mother.
Yes.
And what I'm finding at the moment with the writing and also looking at the interview material that I've shot of her colleagues and friends, I find it incredibly draining. And I seem to be able to only do like an hour, and then I just have to collapse on my bed. And I feel incredibly unproductive because it's like I'm processing this stuff if it was something else, I'd just go and cut it and do it and get it done and it'd be fine. But so I'm just curious about whether you experienced that, and if you did, how you dealt with it. Also feeling so unproductive because it feels so slow, the process.
I think I had times like that, Jane. Definitely had times when I just, I have to go and lie down in the... but there were other times when I just became really engaged as a filmmaker and in editing, in solving problems, and then other times when I just, spiral into my God, what am I doing? And, you know, is anyone going to be interested in this? And how far can I go? And all of those things. And I think that I couldn't have done it if I hadn't had a lot of emotional support in my personal life. I couldn't have done it without that. I had a huge amount of emotional support, and I had somewhere to go to talk about it, and that wasn't connected to film. Nothing to do with film. And I think to do that work, if I hadn't done that work, I wouldn't have even started to make the film. And I think I couldn't have made the film until I'd done a lot of that work anyway. So that I wasn't sort of confused and prey to it. I kind of knew what I thought about a lot of things. There were still things that surprised me at times. When I read my parents' letters, I was really, that was a big, I couldn't read a huge amount of them, but I read enough, and that took me by surprise. But I did think I kind of knew most of it before I started, but it always surprises you. But it's a process, and sometimes you just have to walk away.
Just a little question, really. Observation. Looking at the images and the photographs, you're the merry one.
I'm
the merry one.
I'm the merry one. That's right.
And I've
I'm the
always
joker. That's
found
the
you the merry one in all your work. And yet in the reenactments,
really
you go to the
serious.
sadness.
I go to the sadness.
I'm sort of wondering how...
When am I going to do the comedy?
No, this is not a broadcaster, make it light, question. I'm interested in the merry parts of the stories too, and when they'll appear.
Well, my sister always, as she does say in the film, she said I was the one who had carried the laughter in the family. I was the one who broke the tension and, performed and...
Clowning? Clowning?
Clowning,
Yeah.
all of those sorts of things. And it did break the tension a lot of the time in the house. But then there was this other scary part that was pretty real. So, yeah, but that's how I dealt with it, I suppose. I dealt with it by being big and loud and extroverted and funny and all of those things. And but then I'd have my other swings, of course. And, I do have a very serious side, of course. Yeah. I'd love to make a comedy, actually.
I just had a question about the voiceover, and it was complex, and I just wondered about that process and sort of changing, like when sometimes you'd be sort of addressing in the you person and the second person and to your mother, and just how you went through that process of getting that final voiceover.
Okay. It was quite interesting actually, because I recorded and re-recorded and over and over and over. I didn't just go into a studio and record it in one go or over a few days. I recorded it maybe on 8 or 9 separate occasions with the same microphone, the same sound recordist. And I developed the voiceover as I was editing and changed it and did pickups constantly. And I recorded it at UTS. There was a beautiful microphone there. And the young fellow who recorded it, Luke Bacon, who I'd known since he was a little boy, and he had been a student of mine. And I love Luke. He's just wonderful. And I said, Luke, if I get that really terrible, draggy, my terrible, sad story of my life in my voice, just stop me right there. And he did. And he'd say, Margo, you've got that terrible, draggy, sad story of I said, oh, okay. So, there was only once somebody else recorded, and he did a perfect technical recording, but he never pulled me up, and we had to drop it all and go back and record it. So I was very lucky that I had someone to sort of not really direct me, but to pull me up when I wasn't on the money, you know. And so there was that. And then there was a certain point where I just was stuck, just so stuck with the structure, stuck with the narration that was just telling everybody, you know, this happened and then that happened, so boring. And I sat down one day and I thought, oh, let's just throw it up in the air completely and write a different voice. I don't know if it's going to go in the film or not. And I wrote the story about speaking to my mother when she was dead, which is a true story. And I didn't know if I recorded it. And Luke said, that's amazing. And I went, oh, okay. So then I thought, what do I do? I tried it at the beginning. Didn't work. Tried it somewhere. I tried it and I got rid of it, came back, in and out, different places. And in the end, I thought the only place it can go is the end. Because that's where the shift happens. And so it was an interesting process to develop the narration, because I think I wrote with images as well as words. I didn't have a script when I started, I had a script when I finished. And so the images dictated the narration and the narration dictated the images. So they were speaking to each other. And I'd been an actor and I'd narrated films too. And I thought my voice is okay. I can, you know, as long as I get the drag out of it. And so yeah, it was kind of, and then of course you get attached and you have to cut things out and endlessly. So yes, backwards and forwards, images, sound, over quite a long period of time. Yeah, interesting. It was experiment. I couldn't have written that and gone to a funding body with it. You know, it didn't come together till the film was finished, really. I still would like to cut a couple of bits out of the narration, as you do want to.
Thanks, Margo. I found it a very moving and evocative.
Thank you,
film.
Curtis.
I just wondered, given that you had this huge amount of letters to go through, I wondered how tempted you were to use more of them in the film.
How?
Well, I liked the way you did it actually in terms of you becoming the central voice, and I think it was the right way to go. But I wondered if earlier on in the process you had been tempted to create a voice for both your father and the mother through letters, because that's something I've done in the past, and I just wondered whether you'd been tempted by that at all.
Well, I do it in the film just once, where I do my mother's voice.
But it's quite...
Daddy says, you know, I do this one little thing.
Yeah.
That's the only thing. No, I didn't. No, I didn't. I don't think I could really speak for them. And the letters I found terribly painful and to read, because my father adored my mother and he was so intelligent, and the letters were very moving, because they were. I felt like there weren't that many I could read, because it felt like I was looking into their private life that I really didn't think I should be. The ones I wanted to read were the ones that he sent to her just after I was born. And my sister kept them away from me. I said, I looked at when it took me ages to get the letters out of her. And then I said, where's the letters that Dad sent just after I was born? And she said, I don't think you should read them. I said, oh, still being big sister. So she eventually gave them to me, and I mainly read them and some of Mum's letters when she was travelling, but there was a lot more I couldn't read. I've given them back to my sister. There's only so far I could go with it. And a lot of that, it's trivial stuff too in the letters, and it's a lot of reading to get through, you know, day-to-day trivial stuff. And it was quite an effort to read what I read, And I actually found them I got very emotional reading them too a couple of times. So I didn't use a lot of them, but sort of particular places.
The story, yes, would definitely resonate with other people, and yes, I can just see that happening everywhere. Yeah, other stories that will be triggered by your story. But I wondered if you had thought about the similarity of some of the photographs. There's fashion of the time, there's styles that different photographers had for professional photographs. There were photographs in your documentary that could have been my mother or my sister as a toddler or my grandmother. It was almost identical, mainly because a photograph is taken at sufficient distance that you don't see those individual features of the face, but you pick up on the clothing and the style and the background and the context. So had you given some thought to that?
Look, you're not the first person who said that. I think it's really interesting, and it's something I'd really like to look further at as to how, popular culture and photographs of the time constructed the way that those family photographs were performed, were constructed. I think there's something really interesting there. When Jeni and I did For Love or Money, we did a set of postcards, and there was one postcard from the 1950s, and there's the mother in the kitchen, and she's got her back to the camera, and two little girls. And I've got it on my notice board in my office still, and I always look at that photo and think that's Mum and me and I, even though it isn't.
But Margo, the important point about that photograph is in your narration. The mother's back is to the children.
I never thought of that. That's right. Yeah, I think that's a very interesting point, because I do think that the family photographs really, a number of people have said the same thing to me. It's the 50s, and it was a particular style, and the women's magazines during that time were very, the fashions and the way that people that say the royal family, the photographs of the royal family that were posed together. It'd be fascinating to look at some of how popular culture had informed the construction of those photographs. Yeah, it's a really interesting point.
Thank you so much for bringing that material to the public arena, but also just thinking about our previous questioner's point on the photographs. As I was watching it, in my memory, I was actually recalling the way it was constructed. It sort of followed on from Jeni Thornley's film Maidens, which I don't know if you were sort of aware of that, or maybe just had taken something on internally, because there were certainly parts of that that really took my mind back to sequences in Maidens, in the way the archival photographs were used and then talked about.
I think there were 3 films that had I was inspired by. One of them was Corinne Cantrell's film In This Life's Body, which she made after she was diagnosed with cancer. She's an avant-garde filmmaker, she and her husband Arthur in Melbourne. And it's all still photographs, and it's all her voice. And there's no music, there's not even an atmosphere in it. And it's a masterpiece, it's amazing. The other one was Claire Poirier's film Tu as crié, Let Me Go, which was a documentary she made after her daughter had been murdered, and the way she used metaphor and the way she let the camera sit on, it was interviews, different to mine, but the way it was so personal. I searched for you in black and white. I still remember that narration. It was so amazing. And the third was Maidens, was Jeni's film Maidens, because in Maidens she used her films and she explored the story of her maternal family at the same time as exploring feminism and her embrace of feminism. And so, for me, Maidens was, a pivotal film, very important film, and and inspiring the way that those other films were too. So, we see the work that other people do and think, that's interesting, and I respond to that in an emotional way. And I didn't consciously think about maidens, particularly when I was making the film. But when I wrote about it later, I thought, yes, there's a lot of maidens. It's in the influence of maidens is there too in my unconscious, you know.
I just wanted to follow on from Coralie's point, but also pick up Jane's point in relationship to the struggle involved in making a very personal autobiographical film, the personal struggle as the filmmaker. And I think that actually what's really important for you while you're making this film about your mother is actually, and we've done a bit of the discussion around this, you and me, but is actually to kind of really value what is called the corpus of texts, and it's the corpus of autobiographical text. Now, Margot's referred to Corinne's film and Anne-Claire Poiret's wonderful film. I just want to read you briefly this list, not you personally, but we're not working in a vacuum here. We're working in a tradition, and they're inspirational, these filmmakers. They help us on this journey. Recently, Sofia Turkovits is Once My Mother. William Yang, who's been powering away for decades with his very personal storytelling in slides. Now he's working in film. I just went to his most recent performance last week. Andrew Taylor, a colleague of ours at UTS, has recently made a very beautiful film called First Person Kodachrome about his father's suicide and the role of Kodachrome photographs in his family archive. Romaine Moreton has just done an amazing show out at Campbelltown Arts Centre called 1 Billion Beats, which is it's not strictly autobiographical, I call it autoethnography, or Catherine Russell calls it autoethnography, where she looks at how Aboriginal people have been represented in film and the impact on her as a filmmaker and as an Aboriginal artist and as a poet. Maverick Mother by Jane Merriweather, my own films, Sarah Gibson's The 100th Room, Rivka Hartman's miniskirted Dynamo, Essie Coffey's My Survival as an Aboriginal, Tracy Moffat's Night Cries, which I would maintain is also an autobiography or autoethnography. Darlene Johnston, I know you're here tonight, your film Stolen Generations, it has an autobiographical line running through it. And, of course, and Harold Ferber's wonderful film Remembering Country. And one can even bring an autobiographical reading to Rachel Perkins' First Australians and Hetty Perkins' Art and Soul. So these filmmakers support us in this corpus of works, and we're not alone here, we're in a community.
Margot, I won't take time on reiterating what obviously everybody else has felt about the emotional impact of your film. But it was particularly resonant for me because I grew up and went to school in Mitcham, and Donvale and Ringwood was all...
Right nearby.
That's right. But there was so many... It resonated in so many ways. But another thank you in that I'm about to do my last unit in the... what's now the creative writing degree, but I had written about my father, whom I didn't like at all, for a number of reasons, but in writing of his life and our life as a family, which was also pretty complicated, but at the end of my writing about him, which was largely about his architectural work, I came to find him a much better, more interesting person than I ever thought, because in that era he was very authoritarian and very unapproachable, and brought the family together to do what he believed we should be doing. And ended up with depression. So, there was some similarities, but I guess my point is I would also like to thank you for the lesson in how to expand my thinking, because that's an unfinished work and needs a lot more work on it. But you've helped me think more laterally. Thank you about that.
Pleasure. Okay.
You've talked a little bit of, about having emotional support, and I just and you sort of talked about you felt you've forgiven your mother, but I just wondered how at times that in delving into this story and about yourself had sort of impacted on you, because I sort of felt quite cross for you at times, like, oh, a little person shouldn't really have had to go through that.
That's right. That's right. A little person shouldn't have to go through all that, and the stuff that's not in the film too. My mother was really tricky, and I think it's partly why I had to make the film too, was that it wasn't just the story of Felicity, but it was so connected, is that I had to try and understand why she was like that and why she'd done those things, because they were so thoughtless. And yeah, a little person shouldn't have to go through those things, but little people go through those things all the time, and they survive, and of course these things affect us, but you know.
But I was wondering if the process of making the film had ever took you to places that were quite difficult.
No, psychoanalysis took me to places that were very difficult for me. Making the film was actually quite pleasurable at times, and yes, it did get tricky because I thought, oh, how far can I go? But I did a very long psychoanalysis, and in a quite a Lacanian analysis, so it was tough. And that really took me to places that pushed me to go to places that I really didn't want to have to go to. But I'm glad I did, and I'm glad I'm not doing it anymore. But the film didn't do that in the same way. There were times when I had a little cry, of course, and I thought, can I say this or can I say that? But a film doesn't challenge you. You know, the film isn't going to say, Margo, why you know. So I think the work that you do privately, that's the big challenge. And the work you do in your relationships with other people too, as a result of it. That's, in your closer relationships, they're the really tough challenges. Because of course I've come out of that, but it's not the only thing that I am.
A lot of work has been done by thinkers and writers and filmmakers around the site of the work of mourning. I mean, I see this as a work of mourning, and I see a lot of those works that I mentioned is the corpus of text. And the work of mourning is actually a phrase of Freud's. And the 3 tenets of psychoanalysis is remembering, repeating, and working through. And like Susan Sontag writes about the work of mourning in relationship to Sieberberg's film Our Hitler. She calls it a work of mourning, where he helps the German people deal with their past through making a work about it. And I think, in a way, that's what all these works are that they're working through. And you need a witness. And you're the witness, but you also need a personal witness.
Yeah, I think making this film, I'm the witness to what had happened too. And I agree with Jeni about it being a work of mourning, because once they go, once the mother dies or the father dies, you can't solve anything with them anymore, but you need to work it through in some way. And for all the difficulties I had with my mother and what an absolute bitch she was at times, I adored her. And I wanted her to love me, and those conflicting feelings, that I still needed to work that stuff through, and mourn her loss, and mourn my father's loss, and mourn, death, because that's what's going to happen to us all, and that's what, when they go, we're faced with our own life and our own mortality, and I think the film took me to that place too.
In the film, you mentioned that as children, you and your sister were not close. When did you become close to your sister? Was it a gradual process, or?
When we both left home, and we weren't living with Mum anymore, and I still remember that, how you have those vivid memories. We sort of sat down in Carlton one day, and we'd both left home. We were both, and we went, what the fuck was that? And we talked about what had happened and how we had been divided from each other, how we kind of bonded at that point, but I was probably 19 or 20 and she would have been about 21, and we maintain a very close friendship, even though it's tricky sometimes, but it wasn't until we both left home.
I find it really frustrating now in my 70s that our generation, are still trying to forgive our mothers.
That's awful, isn't it?
Happy International Women's
Oh,
Day.
that's right.